Welcome. Imagine this. It's the year 1347. You've just entered the heart of medieval Europe, a time when fear, disease, and death permeated every aspect of life. Streets once bustling with life now feel eerily empty. The smell of death lingers, heavily in the air. The roads are filthy, lined with rotting bodies and the debris of a collapsing society. The stench is overpowering. Decay, human waste, and blood fill the atmosphere. Every breath feels like you're swallowing death itself. You can hear the faint groans of the sick from nearby homes, but there's nothing you can do. The plague is here, and it's spreading like wildfire. In the distance, you spot a figure moving slowly through the street, draped in a long black cloak. The beak of their mask is almost comical, except for the fact that it's one of the most terrifying sights you've ever seen. This person is a plague doctor, and they're here to try to save lives. You think about how, in today's world, you could Google any symptoms, check the latest health tips, or simply dial a doctor's office for help. But in this time, none of those luxuries exist. The plague doctor is about to attempt the impossible. They'll treat the dying with methods that might sound ridiculous to us today. Methods that might actually make things worse. The air is thick with despair, and as the doctor stumbles by, you can see the hopelessness in their eyes. They're about to put on their heavy, cumbersome cloak and face the horrors that lie ahead. Could you endure this? Could you walk in their shoes? Or would you collapse, overwhelmed by fear, the unbearable stench, and the weight of your impending doom? What if you were the one assigned to this gruesome task? You wouldn't last 5 minutes. You'd find it hard to breathe in the stifling air. The weight of your mask would be unbearable. The dread of knowing that you're walking among death would crush you. And the worst part? You'd be exposed to the plague at every turn. It's only a matter of time before you catch it too. But for now, let's take a step back and look at how things got to this point. How did medieval society descend into such darkness? The Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in history, swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, leaving nothing but death in its wake. It didn't start in Europe, of course. The disease came from the east, carried by fleas on rats that traveled on merchant ships. But once it hit Europe, it spread with terrifying speed. In just a few years, a third of the population was gone. That's roughly 25 million people. Imagine the terror, the sense of helplessness, as whole towns were wiped out, with no way to stop the carnage. That's when the plague doctors appeared, like grim reapers walking among the living. Their long beak masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs, were supposed to filter the poisonous air. And yet, their efforts were as futile as trying to catch smoke in a net. The plague was unstoppable, and they were, for all intents and purposes, walking into a death trap. What would you have done? You'd be facing the same doom, with nothing more than superstition and rudimentary medical knowledge to save you. But you wouldn't have known about bacteria or germs. You wouldn't have understood how disease spreads. All you had was the hope that maybe, just maybe, some magic herb could save you. The problem was, there was no magic, only death. The doctor stumbles through the streets, now part of the disease-ridden world they were trying to fight. You feel the weight of that reality settle in. Every step you take could be your last. And yet, you continue. You wear the mask, you mix the herbs, and you try to convince yourself that you're doing something important. But you know deep down that you're just buying time, not just for your patients, but for yourself. You wonder how long you'll last. How long until the plague takes you too. You hope it will be quick. But you know deep down that death might be a long, painful process. The city is full of mourners, but their tears are of no use. This isn't something that can be prayed away. It's a fight for survival. But for most, survival isn't an option. And so, we begin our journey. Let's step back in time and discover just how this world of fear and death became so entrenched. The medieval mindset was dominated by superstition. Disease wasn't understood scientifically. Instead, it was seen as a punishment from God, a sign of divine wrath. Plague doctors were often the only ones willing to face this wrath head-on, but they were just as doomed as the people they treated. It was a thankless job, filled with fear, and the result was inevitable. So what happened next? What were the key events that set the stage for this dark chapter in history? The answer lies in the way the disease spread. Once it started, there was no stopping it. No quarantine measures, no vaccines, no understanding of germs. The plague was more than a disease. It was a social disaster. And yet, the doctors persisted. Despite the odds, some doctors tried to hold on to hope. They attempted every treatment imaginable, from leeching to bloodletting. But none of it worked. The plague raged on, unchecked, consuming all in its path. It was a world where death was constant, and the very idea of survival seemed like a joke. Could you have survived? Could you have done what the plague doctors did? Chances are you wouldn't last long. The odds were stacked against you. And so, the bleak reality of the plague doctor's life began to unfold. Their fate was sealed the moment they donned that beaked mask. As hopeless as it was, the doctors continued to work, hoping for some miracle, some way to save the dying world around them. But what they didn't know was that the greatest threat wasn't just the disease, it was the fear and ignorance that surrounded them. And soon they'd learn, just as you would, that no amount of herbs or prayers could change their fate. The Black Death would claim them just as surely as it claimed the rest. But for now, let's continue to explore the history. Let's dive deeper into the stories of these doomed individuals. And as we do, remember one thing. You wouldn't last a day as a plague doctor. Not without succumbing to the horrors of that world. It was a time of terror, a time of darkness. And as we explore this world, you'll understand why the plague. Doctors were more than just doomed. They were trapped in a nightmare beyond their control. The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was a catastrophic event that transformed Europe forever. It arrived in Europe in 1347, carried by merchant ships coming from Asia. The disease spread quickly, moving from port to port, killing tens of thousands in a matter of weeks. In the early stages, there was no understanding of how the plague spread. Theories ranged from bad air, miasma, to divine punishment. The role of rats and fleas wasn't discovered until centuries later. But at the time, people had no way of knowing that these small creatures were the cause of their suffering. In the midst of this confusion, the role of the plague doctor emerged. But the truth was, they were just as unprepared as everyone else. The doctors wore masks with long beaks, believing that the herbs they stuffed inside would purify the air. But those masks were more symbolic than effective. And yet, the doctors wore them, hoping that something, anything, could save their patients and themselves. They didn't understand the science behind germs or how diseases were transmitted. Instead, they used superstitions, relying on the notion that the right herbs or a bit of prayer could make a difference. The results were disastrous. As the plague spread, doctors were overwhelmed by the sheer number of people falling ill. And despite their best efforts, most of the doctors became infected as well. Many died within days of treating their first patients. And yet the work continued. These doctors were seen as a necessary evil, their presence a sign that there was at least someone trying to fight back. But their efforts were futile. Death came quickly, often in the form of the deadly buboes that appeared on the skin, and the doctors were left with no answers. But they didn't give up. Instead, they persisted, trying different treatments, all of which were ineffective. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments, but it only weakened the patients further. Other methods included leeching, which was just as useless. The best they could do was comfort the dying, as the plague ravaged town after town. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have stuck with the job, knowing that your own death was just around the corner? Or would you have fled, like so many others? The reality is that for most, there was no choice. The plague doctors were caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. And it wasn't just their lives at risk. They were the ones who had to face the horror every day, seeing death everywhere they turned. The constant deaths began to take a toll. As the doctors worked, they were often exposed to the disease. And before long, many of them were dead, just like their patients. The plague, though, didn't stop there. It continued to spread, claiming more and more lives. And soon, entire communities were wiped out. Cities that once thrived were reduced to ghost towns. The Black Death changed the course of history forever. But how? How did it reshape Europe? The short answer is, in every way imaginable. The economy crumbled, with labor shortages becoming a widespread problem. Trade slowed as merchants feared being infected. The social structure shifted, with peasants demanding higher wages. The religious structure also faltered as people began to question their faith. The plague in many ways broke Europe. But for the doctors, it was a slow and painful death. The people who were meant to save lives became victims of the disease themselves. So, what would have happened if you were a plague doctor back then? Would you have been any different? Would you have managed to survive longer? The truth is, you probably wouldn't have. The odds were stacked against you. The Black Death was a tragedy of epic proportions, and no one, not even the doctors, could escape its grasp. Now let's dive into some of the real stories from the front lines. These aren't just historical facts, they're human lives. Real doctors who walked into the mouth of death. First up, let's talk about Dr. Giovanni from Florence. He was one of the first to arrive in a city already ravaged by the plague. His reputation was built on a foundation of hope, but that hope was quickly shattered. Giovanni believed in the power of herbs. He carried with him a sack filled with garlic, lavender, and other protective plants, thinking they would shield him from the miasma, the so-called poisonous air. But the truth was, no matter how many herbs he stuffed into his mask, the plague was unstoppable. As he moved through the city, treating the sick, he saw entire families die within hours. Desperate, Giovanni began to mix his herbs with other remedies he'd heard of from local healers, none of which worked. The doctors didn't understand the plague. They couldn't see bacteria under a microscope. They couldn't see the tiny creatures that were causing the sickness. All they had were the beliefs of the time and their own intuition. But Giovanni wasn't immune to the disease. Within days, he began to feel the fever. His skin grew cold and clammy. By the time his colleagues noticed, it was too late. Giovanni was one of the many who had caught the plague from his patients. His body started to bloat, the telltale blackening of the skin appeared, and his last moments were filled with fever and confusion. Dr. Giovanni died within a week of contracting the plague. He was one of the last doctors in Florence to fall, victim to the disease. His death marked the end of any hope for the city. Without their doctors, the remaining survivors had no one to turn to. In the midst of this chaos, let's turn to Dr. Henry from London. Henry had heard rumors of treatments that involved leeching the sick to balance their humors. It was a method thought to help restore equilibrium to the body, but in reality, it was as useless as all the others. Henry believed that if he could just balance the humors of the infected, he could save them. So he spent his days applying leeches to his patients, draining them of their blood in an attempt to purge the disease. But in truth, the bloodletting only weakened them further, and none of his patients survived. Dr. Henry tried to remain optimistic, but the more he bled his patients, the more he began to feel the effects himself. His own health began to deteriorate, and within days, he too fell ill. The fever took hold, and his body began to show signs of the plague. He didn't last long. He died within 48 hours, and his body soon became another bloated corpse in the street. In a cruel twist of fate, Dr. Henry's death came swiftly. He had lived through some of the worst moments in the plague, only to succumb to the very disease he'd been desperately trying to treat. Finally, there's the tragic story of Dr. Eleanor from rural France. She had been a physician's apprentice, trained in rudimentary medicine, but she was no expert. The small village she worked in was slowly being decimated by the plague. Patients came to her begging for relief, but all she had were the outdated remedies she had learned in her training. One of the most common treatments at the time was mercury. The idea was that it would purge the body of the disease, but in reality, it was highly toxic. Dr. Eleanor began dosing her patients with mercury in the hopes of saving them. But instead, she only poisoned them. Their bodies started to break down faster, their organs failing as the mercury did its work. But the young doctor didn't know any better. Her desperation grew as she watched the villagers die, one by one. But Eleanor didn't just treat the villagers. She treated herself, believing that the mercury would protect her too. It didn't. Her skin began to turn yellow, her breath became labored, and within days she too was on the brink of death. Eleanor's last moments were filled with regret. She had hoped to save her community, but instead, she had contributed to their demise. Her body, bloated with the toxic effects of mercury, was found alongside her patients. The plague didn't care who you were. It didn't matter if you were a learned doctor or an uneducated peasant. It was an equal opportunity killer. And now, let's reflect on what all this means. What did these stories tell us about the reality of being a plague doctor? The truth is, most doctors were just as unprepared as the rest of society. They didn't have antibiotics, vaccines, or even a basic understanding of hygiene. All they had were superstition and fear. And in the end, that wasn't enough. Dr. Giovanni, Dr. Henry, Dr. Eleanor, all of them were doomed from the start. They didn't have the tools to stop the plague. They had no chance. Imagine walking into that kind of environment every day. The fear, the hopelessness, the constant exposure to death. It's no surprise that so many doctors died. The constant cycle of illness, treatment, and death wore them down. But despite everything, they kept going. They had no choice. There was nowhere to run. The doctors were trapped in a nightmare that they couldn't escape. And unlike the rest of society, they couldn't just hide away. They had to be out there, in the streets, in the homes of the infected. They were the ones who saw death up close. They were the ones who tried to hold on to hope, even when it was slipping away. And yet, none of them survived the plague. The grim reality was that the plague was an unstoppable force. The doctors were walking toward their own deaths, just like their patients. What would you have done in their place? Could you have endured that kind of suffering day after day? The answer is probably no. The plague was too powerful, too widespread. No one could have fought it. And yet the doctors tried. They fought with everything they had. They wore the masks. They mixed the herbs. They used every treatment they knew. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The plague was a force beyond their control. And as the years passed, the world would move on. But the memory of those doctors, those brave, foolish men and women, would remain. Now, as we step back from this grim reality, let's reflect. The doctors of the past were trapped in a time they couldn't escape, in a world that lacked the tools we now take for granted. They didn't have the knowledge, the technology, or the treatments that we do today. Their world was one of fear, superstition, and darkness. They had no understanding of bacteria or viruses, no antibiotics to stop infections, no vaccines to prevent diseases. They were helpless, and in that helplessness, they fought as hard as they could, but despite their efforts, they couldn't save themselves. They couldn't save their patients. The Black Death claimed them all. But as you lay here now, in the comfort of your modern world, take a moment to appreciate what we have today. You can Google symptoms. You can visit a doctor. You can get vaccinated. You can live in a world that's free from the fears that once gripped the medieval world. Your cell phone, your knowledge, and your access to modern medicine would have made you a god in that time. You would have been the one to save lives, not the one walking toward your death. And that's a luxury they could only dream of. So, as you close your eyes tonight, be thankful. Thankful that you live in a world where diseases like the plague are no longer a threat. But don't forget the lesson of history. Don't forget the bravery of those who tried to fight the impossible. Those doctors were a part of something much larger than themselves. And though they failed, their story reminds us of how far we've come. The world today may be far from perfect, but it's a world where medicine has the power to save lives, where knowledge reigns, and where death doesn't loom around every corner. You are living in a time of miracles. And while it's easy to take that for granted tonight, remember how different it was for the doctors of the past. They fought with everything they had, but they didn't have the tools we have, and that's something worth appreciating. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the past, but also think about the future. And remember, tomorrow, we'll be discussing why pirates hated gold and what they preferred instead. It'll be a wild ride, and I promise you'll laugh at what they actually valued more than treasure. So sleep well, knowing that the worst of it is over. You've survived this story, and tomorrow, we'll dive into another strange and surprising tale from history. Sweet dreams, and remember to hit subscribe if you haven't already. You'll want to be here for the next one. Good night, and sleep well, knowing that history's darkest moments are far behind us. For now, rest easy, because you've made it through. You're here, and that's something to be thankful for. Good night, sleep tight, and see you in the next story. We've got much more to explore. Tomorrow we'll reveal the truth behind pirate treasure But for now, close your eyes and drift into sleep. You've earned it. Rest well, you've survived this journey, and you'll survive many more. Take a deep breath. Relax. The night is yours, and tomorrow, the next tale awaits. Until then, sleep tight. Let your dreams be full of peaceful thoughts. And remember, you are living in a time of great privilege. Sleep well, knowing that you've made it through another wild history lesson. If you survived this trip back in time, now it's your turn to make history. Comment below with the keyword "survived the plague" and tell us what left you most speechless. Who could really handle facing the terror of the Black Death until the end? Tag that friend who you think wouldn't last even 5 minutes as a plague doctor. And of course, don't forget to share, because stories like these need to be spread. Don't forget to subscribe for the next one, because tomorrow we'll reveal why pirates hated gold, and you'll laugh at what they really preferred. Click now and sleep like a drunken peasant on moldy bread.